The giant insect swamp. If you have a phobia of bugs, this is officially your worst nightmare. Around 300 million years ago, during the Carboniferous period, Earth was covered in a massive, choking global swamp. But it's what was flying through the air and crawling through the mud that makes this era truly terrifying. During this time, the planet was experiencing a massive botanical boom. Plants and trees were pumping out so much oxygen that the atmosphere was completely saturated. Oxygen levels skyrocketed to 35%, nearly double what we have today. And this hyper-oxygenated air acted like a biological steroid for insects. Because bugs breathe through tiny tubes in their bodies instead of lungs, their size is strictly limited by how much oxygen is in the air. In this supercharged atmosphere, they grew to monstrous, apocalyptic proportions. If you stood in this swamp, you would be hunted by Meganeura, a giant species of dragonfly with a wingspan the size of a crow. These weren't harmless bugs. They were apex aerial predators that used their massive jaws to snatch up primitive reptiles right off the ground. But the nightmare gets worse on the forest floor. Crawling through the rotting wood was Arthropleura, a giant armored millipede that grew up to 8.5 feet long and weighed over 100 pounds. Imagine a centipede longer than a king-size bed, slithering through the dark shadows beside you. There were also scorpions the size of dogs and cockroaches as big as dinner plates. It was a world completely ruled by giant, scuttling creepy crawlies. But this horror show eventually choked on its own success. The massive forests pumped out so much oxygen and buried so much carbon that they triggered a massive shift in the global climate. The planet cooled down, the intense oxygen levels collapsed, and the suffocating swamps dried up, finally shrinking these giant monsters down to the bugs we swat at today. The last glacial maximum. Around 20,000 years ago, Earth was locked in the grip of the last glacial maximum, a brutal, freezing era where runaway glaciers transformed the entire northern hemisphere into an unlivable wasteland. Driven by shifts in Earth's orbit, temperatures plummeted worldwide. Massive ice sheets began marching down from the Arctic, swallowing up modern-day Canada, the northern United States, and large chunks of Europe and Asia. These weren't just standard winter glaciers. This was a crushing heavy armor of solid ice that grew up to 2 miles thick. The sheer weight of this ice sheet was so immense that it literally warped the Earth's crust, pushing the continents down into the mantle. Because so much of the planet's water was locked up in these massive frozen walls, global sea levels dropped by an astonishing 400 feet. This dramatic water loss caused the oceans to shrink, exposing millions of square miles of raw seafloor and turning Earth into a dry, dusty, and violent world. With the oceans shrunk and the climate frozen, the planet's water cycle broke down. Rainfall stopped almost entirely, turning vast regions into hyper-arid deserts. Ferocious, freezing winds screamed across the barren landscapes, whipping up apocalyptic dust storms that choked the atmosphere and blocked out the sun for weeks at a time. If you tried to survive back then, you would be forced into a desperate, freezing migration alongside mammoths and saber-toothed cats, dodging relentless blizzards and hunting for scarce food on the edges of the ice. This crushing freeze gripped the planet for thousands of years, pushing early human populations to the absolute brink of extinction before the world finally began to thaw. The Mega Flood Desert. Around 6 million years ago, a massive shift in Earth's tectonic plates literally cut off the Atlantic Ocean from the Mediterranean Sea, triggering one of the most extreme geographic collapses in history. With its primary water supply completely blocked at the Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean became a trapped bowl. Because the region was incredibly hot, the water evaporated faster than rivers could refill it. Within just 1,000 years, the entire Mediterranean Sea completely dried up. What was left behind was a giant, apocalyptic desert basin dropping over 2 miles below sea level. If you stood down there, it would feel like walking on the surface of another planet. The air pressure was so heavy it would make your ears pop constantly, and the temperature routinely soared past a blistering 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The entire seafloor became a blinding white wasteland covered in a massive, mile-thick crust of pure salt. For over 500,000 years, this suffocating boiling abyss divided Europe and Africa. But the real terror came when the barrier finally broke. The tectonic wall at the Strait of Gibraltar began to crack, and the entire Atlantic Ocean came crashing in. It started as a massive waterfall, but the sheer force of the water quickly tore the canyon wide open, unleashing the unstoppable Zanclean flood. This wasn't a normal flood. It was a catastrophic wall of water moving at highway speeds, with a volume 1,000 times greater than the Amazon River. The roar of the incoming ocean would have been deafening from hundreds of miles away. The water ripped through the landscape with such violence that it filled the entire Mediterranean basin back up in less than 2 years, sometimes raising the water level by over 30 feet in a single day, instantly erasing everything in its path. The Boiling Hothouse. Around 56 million years ago, Earth experienced a sudden, terrifying spike in temperature that pushed the planet's climate to its absolute limit. A massive surge of carbon was injected into the atmosphere, likely triggered by intense volcanic eruptions and the sudden melting of frozen methane deposits on the seafloor. Within just a few thousand years, greenhouse gases shot up to extreme levels, causing global temperatures to skyrocket by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Because the planet was already completely ice-free, this sudden heat spike transformed Earth into a hypertropical, suffocating hothouse. The global climate was turned entirely upside down. Palm trees and alligators began thriving in the Arctic, while the regions around the equator became completely unlivable. Temperatures there crossed 100 degrees with near 100% humidity, creating a wet bulb effect that would instantly kill a human today. But the real horror was happening in the oceans. As the atmosphere absorbed the massive influx of carbon, a huge portion of it dissolved into the seawater. This triggered rapid ocean acidification, essentially turning the world's oceans into a giant corrosive bath of mild acid. The acid dissolved the protective shells of marine organisms, causing the entire deep-sea food chain to completely collapse. At the same time, the extreme heat starved the oceans of oxygen, triggering massive dead zones where fish and other marine creatures literally suffocated in the hot water. On land, the heat forced a bizarre evolutionary panic. Because resources became scarce and mammals couldn't shed heat efficiently, animals began to dramatically shrink in size. Early primitive horses shrunk down to the size of house cats, and ancient primates became miniature versions of themselves just to survive the grueling climate. This boiling nightmare gripped the planet for over 100,000 years, serving as a terrifying preview of what happens when the planet's atmospheric thermostat gets completely broken. Mushroom Kingdom Earth. Long before towering redwood trees or dense jungles existed, Earth's dry land was ruled by an entirely different kind of giant. During the Devonian period, about 400 million years ago, the planet's continents looked like a surreal, nightmare landscape. If you walked on land back then, you would be surrounded by a claustrophobic alien world. The very first land plants were tiny, primitive things standing only a few inches off the ground, but shooting up from the dirt were massive, trunk-like structures growing up to 26 feet tall and 3 feet wide. For over a century, scientists dug up these massive fossilized pillars and were completely stumped. They originally assumed they were ancient, weirdly shaped pine trees, but in 2007, a groundbreaking chemical analysis revealed a terrifying truth. These weren't trees at all. They were humongous, ancient fungi known as prototaxites. These titanic mushrooms didn't have caps like modern toadstools. Instead, they stood like smooth, towering obelisks scattered across the barren earth. Imagine walking through a silent forest where every single tree is actually a living, breathing fungal monster. The secret to their massive size was a complete lack of competition. Because there were no large plant-eating animals on land yet, and no trees to block out the sun, these giant fungi were able to grow completely unchecked. They didn't need sunlight to survive. Instead, they acted like a global network of decomposers, slowly digesting rotting organic matter directly from the raw soil. However, their reign as the tallest structures on the planet didn't last forever. True plants eventually evolved deep root systems, wood and leaves, allowing them to shoot up toward the sky and steal the sunlight. By the late Devonian, the first true forests emerged, choking out the light, shading out the giant mushrooms, and driving this real-life horror kingdom to extinction. The Archean Eon. Long before plants turned our planet green, Earth may have gone through a vibrant purple phase. During the early Archean Eon, about 3.5 billion years ago, the first microscopic life forms emerged in the oceans. Today, modern plants use a green pigment called chlorophyll to absorb sunlight and generate energy. But chlorophyll is a highly complex molecule, and back then, life hadn't invented it yet. Instead, scientists believed the dominant organisms on early Earth relied on a much simpler molecule called retinol, the exact same chemical our eyes use today to detect light, and this chemical changed the entire look of the planet. While green chlorophyll absorbs red and blue light and reflects green, retinol does the exact opposite. It absorbs green light and reflects back a striking mixture of red and violet. If you were looking down from orbit during this era, the vast shallow oceans wouldn't look blue or green. They would look like a deep swirling shade of lavender. But beneath the purple waves, a literal battle for light was brewing. Newer, green-reflecting organisms eventually evolved, but they were forced to live beneath the massive floating mats of purple microbes. To survive in the shadows, these green microbes developed chlorophyll to catch the specific wavelengths of light that the purple microbes filtered out and ignored. It was a brilliant survival strategy. Over millions of years, this green strategy proved to be way more efficient at making energy than the old purple method. The green microbes eventually took over the planet and won the war for sunlight, driving the ancient purple life into extreme, high-salt environments where their descendants still live today. The toxic oxygen wasteland. Around 2.4 billion years ago, Earth experienced its deadliest planetary catastrophe. But it wasn't caused by a massive asteroid or a roaring supervolcano. It was triggered by a microscopic biological explosion. At the time, Earth was an alien world. The atmosphere had zero breathable oxygen, filled instead with toxic methane and carbon dioxide. The oceans were dominated by ancient microbes that thrived in this suffocating environment. To them, oxygen wasn't life. It was a deadly, corrosive poison. Then, a new player evolved, cyanobacteria. This microscopic green bacteria invented a revolutionary biological trick called oxygenic photosynthesis. They began using sunlight to split water molecules for energy, releasing oxygen gas into the ocean as a completely accidental waste product. For millions of years, the planet managed to defend itself. The ancient oceans were packed with dissolved iron, which acted like a giant chemical sponge. The moment the bacteria leaked oxygen, the iron soaked it up, rusted, and sank to the sea floor, creating massive red rock formations. But this planetary buffer had a limit. Eventually, the iron ran out and the waters became totally saturated with gas. With nowhere else to go, the toxic oxygen began bleeding out of the water and rising into the sky. The results were apocalyptic. The gas acted like an environmental bleach in the atmosphere, triggering what scientists believe is the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. It wiped out an estimated 99% of all life on the planet, chemically burning the ancient microbes from the inside out. But the nightmare didn't stop there. As the oxygen filled the sky, it crashed into the atmospheric methane, the powerful greenhouse blanket that kept the planet warm. The oxygen tore the methane apart, turning it into weak carbon dioxide. Without its thick methane blanket, Earth's temperature instantly plummeted. The planet was plunged into its very first global ice age, locking the entire world in a brutal, crushing freeze that lasted for 300 million years. Snowball Earth. Around 700 million years ago, Earth looked nothing like it does today. There were no ice caps, no glaciers, and no frozen poles. Instead, the planet was a warm, open ocean world, dominated by one single massive supercontinent called Rodinia. But beneath the surface, a geological time bomb was ticking. Rodinia began to rip itself apart. As the supercontinent cracked into smaller pieces, it created thousands of miles of brand new coastlines and exposed raw volcanic rock to the elements. This split triggered a deadly chain reaction in the sky. Mega monsoons began to batter these newly exposed rocks. As the rain washed over the volcanic stone, a massive chemical reaction took place. The rocks acted like a giant carbon trap, literally sucking carbon dioxide straight out of the atmosphere and burying it in the ocean floor. Without its heat blanket, the planet's temperature plummeted. As the world cooled, white ice caps began to form at the poles. And this is where physics took over. Because white ice acts like a giant mirror, it began reflecting up to 90% of the sun's heat right back into space. This created a terrifying, unstoppable loop. The more the planet froze, the more sunlight it rejected. And the more sunlight it rejected, the colder it got. Glaciers marched away from the poles and slammed shut at the equator, locking Earth in a 2-mile-thick shell of ice. From space, Earth looked completely dead, a blindingly bright white marble. But deep beneath the ice, a hidden force was at work. Volcanoes never stopped erupting. For tens of millions of years, they choked the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. Because the oceans were frozen solid, they couldn't absorb the gas. The carbon dioxide built up to extreme levels, trapping heat like an ultra-powerful greenhouse. The planet warmed up so fast that it shattered the global ice sheets in a geological blink of an eye. The sudden, violent melting unleashed the most catastrophic hyperstorms the world has ever seen, permanently reshaping the future of life on Earth. The Great Dying. Around 252 million years ago, a massive chain of supervolcanoes began erupting through giant fissures in the crust, pumping out continuous flows of magma. They vomited enough lava to bury the entire United States under more than a mile of molten rock. But the lava wasn't the main killer. As the magma blasted upward, it shattered through colossal underground deposits of coal. It essentially set the planet's fossil fuels on fire, blasting trillions of tons of toxic gas straight into the sky. This sudden explosion of carbon dioxide triggered catastrophic global warming. Temperatures on land quickly soared past a lethal 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme heat then transferred to the oceans, stripping the water of up to 80% of its oxygen and suffocating marine life en masse. But then, the disaster took an even more terrifying turn. With the oceans hot, stagnant, and starved of oxygen, a deadly new player emerged from the deep: anaerobic bacteria. These toxic microbes thrived in the dead water and began pumping out massive, invisible clouds of hydrogen sulfide gas. This toxic gas didn't stay in the water. It bled out into the atmosphere, wrapping the entire planet in a silent cloak of poison. If you were standing on Earth back then, you wouldn't just burn from the heat, you would be choked to death by the very air you breathed. The gas was so potent it even rose up and dissolved the ozone layer, allowing lethal UV radiation from the sun to blast and mutate the surviving life on the surface. By the time the eruptions finally stopped, 96% of all marine species and 70% of all land animals were completely wiped out. It was the closest life on Earth ever came to total annihilation, leaving behind a scarred, empty world. The Hadean Eon. If you could travel back 4.5 billion years to Earth's earliest days, you wouldn't find a blue planet. Instead, you'd be looking at a glowing, hellish nightmare, a global, churning ocean of molten rock up to 200 miles deep. This was the Hadean Eon, where surface temperatures routinely topped 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt solid stone and turn iron into liquid rivers. This extreme heat came from three main sources: the crushing friction of gravity pulling the young world together, intense radioactive decay in the core, and a non-stop apocalyptic hammering by space debris. The sky wasn't blue either. It was a choking, heavy blanket of vaporized rock, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, creating an atmospheric pressure 100 times heavier than what we feel today. But just as the planet's surface finally began to cool, it faced a literal world-ending event. A rogue Mars-sized planet named Theia came screaming out of the dark and smashed directly into Earth at 25,000 miles per hour. The impact was so violent it completely liquefied Earth's surface all over again, turning the entire world back into a boiling ball of lava. It also blasted a massive ring of debris into orbit, which gravity clumped together to form our moon. For decades, scientists believed this ultimate smash-up left Earth as a boiling wasteland for hundreds of millions of years. They assumed no liquid water could possibly exist. But they were wrong. The planet had a secret locked away in its rocks. The proof comes from tiny indestructible crystals called zircons found in Western Australia. These microscopic time capsules are older than the continents themselves, and they actually survived the magma ocean. Their chemistry reveals a shocking truth. Despite the planetary collision, Earth managed to cool down, form its very first solid crust, and fill its liquid water oceans way ahead of schedule, setting the stage for life much earlier than anyone dreamed.